we are going to just make the most of our time and jump right in. So let me begin by grounding us, just again, regrounding us in this day and age of just exploding data, where AI is at the center of innovation, and where we have to think about how we use AI responsibly to reap the incredible benefits, like a high wire balancing act. So, Sandy, we'd love to turn to you to frame this debate for us on sort of what the ethical guardrails are that we should be thinking about with regard to AI.
Okay. So I think the most transformative thing that's happened recently to me is I was at Oxford Internet Institute, which is sort of a leader in this area, and someone got up and gave a great talk about bias and fairness and the danger of algorithms. And then the justice minister from Kenya got up and said, what you say may be true, but have you seen what we have today? Almost anything you could do would be better than that. And the point to take away is not that you shouldn't worry about this stuff. The point is that you need to pay attention to what's happening. You need to have data about how things are actually working, and you need to audit it. The stakeholders need to be in control of the process so that they can know whether it's doing what you intended to do. And that's really the key. We don't have that for humans. Humans are black boxes too, right? And we don't know about whether the judge is biased because we don't keep track of it. We don't know about broken windows. We don't know about many things because we don't keep track of them adequately. And if you're going to do AI, you need to do that. Now, this starts from the roots on up. So about 20 years ago, I led the autonomous vehicle effort for Nissan, which is now the largest deployed autonomous vehicle in the world. However, we stopped at what they call level 2, where the human is involved in the autonomous vehicle, because I saw that there were ethical concerns that had to do with people understanding and accepting what the new rules would be. In fact, actually, they needed to be able to generate a new consensus about the role of this technology in society. Similarly, when I started the discussion that led to GDPR, the theme was people knowing what's going on, people being informed about it, which is a lot more than just a EULA or something like that, of course, but it's actually more than that because it implies data literacy, it implies political power by people in order to be able for the intent and feeling of the people to be expressed. So GDPR is seen by many people in this area as a problem, this European privacy law. And the key of it is really auditing and the right to control data, the right to know what's going on. And people say, oh, no, it's going to be a headache. When I chaired AT&T's big data board, I realized that they did this defaultly, just to avoid liability. It's not hard. Yeah, it's a different thing to do, but you need to keep track of your company. And since we started the GDPR discussions, I've started more than a dozen companies. And we do it with the attitude that having your customers know what's happening and involved in that is actually an opportunity to have a better relationship with them than just doing something and not explaining. Yeah, it's a little more work, but you end up a lot more sticky. You end up with something where you can actually get data, get involvement that you wouldn't otherwise want to be able to do because you have a trusted relationship. And I think that's really, at the very heart of this, that trusted relationship that comes from knowing what's happening, auditing, having stakeholders at the table so that there's accountability for what's happening from the various people that are being affected. It's very old stuff. But we need to sort of renovate how we do it in this new age of big data.
Great, great. So, John, we're going to actually each take an opportunity to comment on this very kind of broadly. But just with your experience on IEEE and values-based design, how do you pick up on this and think about that in terms of how you think about and your organization think about those guardrails and baking those values into sort of the conversation with companies and customers?
Sure. Well, first off, just want to say a huge thank you to be here, a real honor. We were joking about this. We're both equally intimidated by each other in terms of our respect for each other. So it just balances out, and that's the same way I feel. I'm an acolyte of Sandy's. Also, Sandy wins the debate because those shoes are awesome. So you win.
Wait a minute, come here.
Well, I'm sorry. All right.
Oh, there we go.
Sandy wins in one category, I guess.
Yeah.
Want to be ethical. So Sandy said it beautifully. I'll paraphrase how we think and give more of a background to what we do. But there's this idea, I think, that privacy tends to be this understandably very big word that can mean GDPR, law, et cetera. But it also sometimes usually stems from an idea of preference, how individuals' values frame how they think about their own data, which makes total sense. But what Sandy said so beautifully is there's this idea of parity, and we talk about clarity of data and the fact that it's not just this sort of, for let's say, citizens or average people, is not just this sort of jumbled mass that is tracked from us, especially as we go into virtual reality and augmented reality. It really represents the core of who we are. And a clarity about something like your currency in terms of your money, no one argues that you can take your cash and put it in checking, savings, and do all this beautiful investment work that Glasswing are experts at. But I think sometimes we need to be, what we believe is, there needs to be a fundamental restructuring of how people think about who they are in relationship to their data. So that there isn't this sort of sense of like it's transactional and I'll use it for this and this, but together in aggregate it represents who you are. So a phrase we use is we say help people, put people at the center of their data. The amazing work that Tim Berners-Lee is doing that we just heard about, same ideology, couldn't align without more. It's not competitive in one sense to business or government. It's a yes and. Mm-hmm. And this is beautiful opportunity with all these amazing algorithmic and intelligent tools, which is how we refer to AI. Autonomous and intelligent systems, rather, is this wonderful opportunity. And a phrase we also use is, a lot of times you hear people say, with privacy, what have you got to hide? And our answer is, what is ours to reveal? There's this beautiful sense of outside-in tracking that can come from all these amazing tools and the ecosystem that's here that, to the point of what we've already heard, we can realign. But there's this also critical recognition that people need to be reminded. I have this phrase from my last book where I say, how will machines know what we value if we don't know ourselves? And I use this phrase called ROI, sorry if it's cheesy, but a return on introspection, where we, looking at our own self and our values individually and then societally, get to really say, these beautiful machines, how can we build them in such a way that they actually reflect our values? Part of that means we have to actually know enough about our values to say that they sync. Then lastly, I'll just tell you the work I do, which is a little bit faster. So IEEE, I'm honored to be a part of IEEE. It's the world's largest professional technological organization. It was founded by Thomas Edison over 100 years ago. It has almost 500,000 members in more than 160 countries. It's truly the global heart of the engineering community. I didn't know about engineering very well until about 2014 when they asked me to speak at South by Southwest about my last book, which was really about looking for a code of ethics for AI. I was doing some work for Mashable and The Guardian as a writer, and stupidly thought, like, where's the code of ethics on the web? Like, what part of the web is that on? And I kept interviewing people, CTOs, CIOs, and they said, well, mainly we go to Asimov's laws of robotics. And I was like, cool. For the multi-million-dollar or billion-dollar organization, you're using a great short story from the 50s. You know, I love that short story. Anyway, so I went to IEEE and I said, you're the UN of tech, as far as I could tell. You comprise the engineers and the data scientists that are literally building the future with standards, et cetera. If we can get the anthropologists, the social scientists, the big thinkers, the marketers to come in here and really think about these issues, this seems like a good time. And thankfully, there were people at IEEE who were already thinking this way. And since then, we've created a resource. It's really a book called Ethically Aligned Design. It's free. It's Creative Commons. It's over 280 pages. It's not really principles. We feel it's a lot more. It's 10 chapters. Law, personal data, effective computing, sustainability, well-being, to think about the algorithmic future as a holistic entity. And then we've created 14 standards working groups focused on these issues. All are invited. They're free to join. And many of them are now about to launch. Ethically aligned design has been used. We are honored by groups like the OECD, the EU, for their high-level expert group that came out in the UAE. And a lot of businesses, IBM, which was spoken about earlier, we were thrilled. They used the second version of our paper because over 500 people wrote it, and we got about 1,000 people that provided feedback for the past 3 years. IBM created a paper called Everyday Ethics for Artificial Intelligence based on our work. That's exactly what we wanted to do with our paper and this work, was to say, this is not the only answer, it's just a start. And for version 1 that's now out, I'd love to talk to you more about getting involved in future versions.
Excellent.
First of all, I'm very happy to be on a panel that starts with a recognition, an acknowledgement that even though there are huge challenges and things are very different, it's not quite as different as we think. That we have a culture and a tradition that has handled these sorts of problems one way or another. We are indeed black boxes. It's arguable about how well we have handled that over time. I think it's not even arguable. And also, I'm really happy, John, to hear you talk immediately about values. My starting point is I really am fascinated and I have to say thrilled by the inexplicability of a lot of AI, that the models that AI builds for itself, as opposed to the models that we've built for ourselves over the thousands of years of our culture, and as we've programmed computers as well, which is usually a matter of figuring out what the relevant factors are and what the relationships are, and you build the model, that the sorts of models that AI builds for itself are often, not always, to one degree or another, unintelligible to us. They're working differently. They're not looking for generalizations. They're not particularly, I understand overfitting, but they're not looking for high-level generalizations under which we can subsume particulars and thus have explained them. When we can find them in the systems, that's great. Sometimes the systems will generate generalizations of that sort that just don't track to the human way of thinking about things. When you've got 1,024 dimensions of dimensional space, doesn't necessarily lead to the sorts of generalizations that we can understand, even when there are these broad generalizations. I am fascinated by the fact that we are relying upon systems because they work, they are more accurate or faster or cheaper, that don't think the way that we do, that don't insist on looking for overarching generalizations in every case, and that this may be giving us a different idea about how the world works, and I think a more mature and humble view as a species of how the world works. I feel obliged to mention a book of mine came out 2 weeks ago on this topic called Everyday Chaos. I also would like to be the first person to reference Bruce. Hi, Bruce. Talking to him earlier. I think this should be a continuing theme. Every presentation should have a call out to Bruce.
Got it.
Which are totally deserved. So I don't want to pass over the sort of standard question of bias. How many of you don't need to hear somebody on a panel explaining briefly, I'm going to do it anyway, what the fundamental problem of bias is in AI? I'll do it. It's going to be familiar in any case. So from my point of view, this is AI's original sin, is its tendency towards bias, in that it is connected directly to the essence of machine learning. Because machine learning obviously learns from data. The data, when it reflects human configurations, human stuff, is going to reflect the biases that are in our culture. All right, so the standard example, or a standard example, is that if you're trying to train a system on to sort through job applications, which is maybe not something we want to do, but we'll talk about that in a second. You give it lots and lots of data about current employment situations, and it's going to learn that women don't correlate very well with senior management positions. And if you're not aware of that, I hope everybody here, of course, is aware of that and is aware of it as a problem inherent in machine learning, then you are very likely going to, your system is going to learn from that, reproduce it, and maybe amplify it. This problem is, thankfully, the subject of a great deal of attention by incredibly smart people, computer scientists, social scientists, and others. It's not solved, but it's comforting to me that this is being addressed so well that it actually gives me the courage or foolish courage to assume that we all understand how important that is, and it's going to go forward, so that I can say something else about this, which is that while it's vital, one more thing. You solve bias, you have not solved the entire issue, because Sandy, I feel awkward calling you that. I really should call you Dr. Pentland. Sorry.
Sandy's actually pretty good.
I already called you Sandy. Is that cool?
So Sandy mentioned a couple times the importance of having all the stakeholders involved. The question of who are the stakeholders is not easily, we don't all agree about that. So another standard example is that you could use machine learning to make your city's bus system more efficient, more people, shorter times, all that sort of thing. And it will do that. And it will look like a solved problem until somebody steps back and says, oh, it did it by avoiding all the poor parts of town. So who are the stakeholders? And then I think it's getting to be pretty widely recognized. We need a large set of stakeholders involved, but how do you involve them? Our attempts to do so far frequently fall apart as the groups disagree about who is a legitimate stakeholder, how much diversity of which sort. Well, we don't really want this sort of person representing this point of view and whatever. The mechanism for involving the stakeholders is not at all resolved yet, and it's a hugely important issue, and it will be. But this is something we have to come to.
David, let me just interrupt for a second, and
that's the only way I'll stop.
and pick up on this kind of sort of idea of bias, right? The data reflects who we are. We have certain values. We are a bit biased. We do have this, incredible example of Amazon and that recruiting kind of algorithm that they put into place. But Sandy, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. How do we solve for it?
Currently, for instance, we're helping the countries of Colombia, Brazil, and Mexico on exactly these problems. And as you said, the stakeholder question is a really difficult question. So what we actually do is we give them a design dashboard. So they say, oh, well, here's a policy or an AI, and it makes these decisions. And then we've sent out thousands of people into the field to be able to sort of get the ground truth as best as one can. But the question of how much bias is too much, the fairness of different groups, the performance, is fundamentally a political question. It's going to be messy. We have all these societal structures to do it. And today, if you're going to do something in the short term, you have to make use of those political structures. You have to realize that good enough is not something that's a technological question, it's a political question. And any place that we go, and we work all around the world, we engage all of the political structures at every level that we can, because it's not us that makes the decisions, it's them that makes the decisions. And that's inherently very messy. But what's interesting is when you use these tools, you create a visualization of what's happening that they've never seen before. So a lot of the contention is around the facts. And if you've spent a couple $1 million going and talking to people to get the ground truth, and you've been able to actually show how the current system works versus the proposed system, you're at least debating the same thing. It may not be exactly right, but it makes the political discussion, I think, a lot more effective.
And should this happen sort of when in the process, right? Is this discussion?
Continually,
yep.
Starting before you actually deploy things if you can. So that's what the role of a pilot or experimentation is.
Right.
Is you should try things out in a sandbox, and that should be instrumented so that all of the questions that different people have can begin to be answered. You can figure out what are the questions that need to be answered.
Right.
You need to shop it around, just like you shop around your value proposition to investors. Mm-hmm. You need to shop around your performance and the things that you're doing to various stakeholders who are likely to go and nuke you afterwards. So you can, as an investor, look at this as risk management.
Right.
Right?
Can I make a quick point, a follow-on point to this? So one of the things I think is really interesting that's happened, that's a wonderful answer, is that Our encounter with machine learning and trying to make it fair and remove as much bias as we can, I think, is quite possibly altering our ideas about how fairness works, because we've taken fairness more or less as an absolute. Turns out when you operationalize fairness by having to explicitly instruct the machine what sorts of outcomes you're going to count as fair and what the variables are that you're willing to play with, that fairness, first of all, new types of fairness have emerged, very precisely defined. There's a literature about that, and that's sort of mind-blowing. Second of all, it turns out that fairness involves trade-offs. You have what will count as a fair number of women in senior management. You have to make decisions that will. That's a terrible example. What sorts of positions, how fast, what the likelihood of what risk you're willing to take as a company, and all the rest of it, because the machine more or less demands that. And the notion that there are these sorts of, that fairness is complex, it's not simple, and that there are inevitably trade-offs, and these trade-offs are trade-offs of values, as you said, which involves a political process in which people are making, talking about what they want, that's a really healthy discussion.
So let's just say that, some portion of the people get fairness thing right, and others maybe don't, right? How do we think about the importance of accountability, auditability, sort of as these things get developed and then they play out as they do? What are the mechanisms in place? What should they be so that we can sort of see through this?
I think John said something which I strongly endorse, is you should think about data fairness and things a lot of the way you think about money. So did someone steal the money? If I put my money in the bank, can I get it back? Am I getting a fair return? Mm-hmm. Are we redlining poor districts and not giving them loans because they're poor? That's bias question again. So a lot of the structures we have around money need to be in place around data. Mm-hmm. And being aware of where we are. So if you're investing in companies in this space, you need to realize that there is an investment risk, just like when you invest money in something, right? If you do something that runs across regulatory things, you can get nuked. Those regulatory things are not fixed. The way they are today is not the way they will be 5 years from now. So when you're trying to get liquid, it's going to be a different environment. And you had better be very much on the good side as a risk management strategy. I mean, I'm an endorser of social values, but just looking at from the money point of view, stay away from the third rail, because some of us will get electrocuted as the standards and the discussion involves.
Yeah, please.
Well, so a couple of things. IEEE is a big organization. So first of all, I'm speaking A as John and B as the executive director of the group that I run. So disclaimers, accountability, enjoy. I think one thing of just to go to bias and then to get to accountability. Bias has so many layers. If you work in ethics, you understand very quickly the difference between Western and Eastern ethics. Western ethics are based on Greek traditions, which oftentimes focuses on the individual. Eastern traditions are oftentimes more communal-based. And then if you go to some place like Africa, what I think is a beautiful tradition of Ubuntu ethics, this idea of well-being begins once your well-being is taken care of, then I can think about my own. It's easy to say, well, this is right and that is wrong. But once you kind of even just understand the paradigm level of bias, where also bias is not a synonym for wrong. Bias is a synonym oftentimes for values. But you have to ask, I'm being very general and I'm from the West, but my colleagues from China or Japan or whatever else, I love talking about these things because I'm like, how do you even orient a discussion about democracy? Should we use a phrase like self-determination for data agency, where then a lot of times Western democracy, that sort of word can fall into a room and make things really awkward for a long time. Then the other thing, I was saying this to you beforehand, bias in code is, in general, 1 and 0s. And I have a friend from China, she's fascinating, and on Twitter, I just don't mess with her on Twitter. But she talks about, I don't do it. She's brilliant, and she talks about, again, Greek traditions sort of created this sense of a binary kind of logic. And in one sense, that means code with 1 and 0s. She says that it's biased because the Chinese traditions, which are 5,000 years older, sort of predate. For me and for our work, a lot of the biggest bias that we're always asking is, what is the main societal value for what we're creating? And I think what I love being, and I'm honored again to be in this investment community that are starting so many beautiful things, is to recognize a lot of the sort of metrics. And this is where, again, I'll just get over my intimidation and point to them. But Sandy's work with the UN SDGs is fundamental. The OECD's Better Life Index. Bhutan kind of kicked things off with gross national happiness. The UN, the work of Jeffrey Sachs. There's this movement that's now about 20 or 30 years old to say, along with GDP, as one metric of value which measures productivity and growth, what are the other things that we need to measure? What are the other things that we aren't seeing and not including? And for instance, one of those things, if you want to talk about women and bias in hiring, is traditionally GDP doesn't measure caregiving. And women are still the primary caregivers around the planet. So if you want to go old school transitive theory of math, and math is not my strong suit, again, MIT, enjoy. If the GDP doesn't measure if the GDP doesn't measure caregiving, and caregiving is largely done by women, then that means the actual metrics, the primary metric that the planet uses is still GDP. But I was in Korea with OECD. I was in Paris recently with OECD. There's so many beautiful components with these metrics that can be helped by AI, meaning the things like statistical learning for economists. Machine learning is beautiful for that, gathering massive amounts of data, analyzing it. But I think there's also this core thing, which also goes back to accountability, which is if the accountability is sort of quarterly, end-of-year focused only, which I know it isn't, but that's oftentimes, in my experience, I was an EVP of a top 10 PR firm. It was easy to oftentimes close the door, and you talked about value, you talked about your customers, of course you talked about CSR and ESG. But then what were the decisions that you made? Typically it was, will we make our numbers? Those 5 words were the words that controlled all. Where a lot of our work is focused on, can we realign innovation for the algorithmic age? So the question is, numbers are critical, done. People, planet are the other 2 big parts of that. The planet is in a place where if environmental, not just sustainability, but flourishing is not prioritized, nothing is sustained. And the same thing with people and mental health. A lot of times, it's not that we don't think about those things. They're not thought about in the same way. And so a lot of our dream is sort of saying, how can these conversations take place where amazing organizations like Glasswing and the amazing companies they support, the CEOs of those rooms go into those rooms and she can say, our triple bottom line numbers are here. And that's how we think the bias and then the accountability more and more needs to be on the other 2 that haven't had as much focus, mainly because the money stuff is.
Yeah. So fantastic. I want to pick up on the China example. China's a place where they don't have a heavy regulatory framework, maybe around AI, and we're seeing just leaps and bounds of innovation there now happen. And so one of the questions I have is, as we think about what you're saying and the importance of it, right? People, planet, marrying that with our strive for profit, GDP, all of that. How do we think about sort of what I was saying in the beginning of like balancing this kind of exciting innovation, which can happen sometimes like Wild West, right, when anything goes, and establishing some real regulatory, potentially, guardrails or around some of these other value-based things around planet and what's good for the people. How do we think about, to what extent we're willing to kind of do that and then pull back on innovation, or do we need to?
So I know a fair amount about China because I run an institute there.
Yes, you do.
Principally to find out what's happening in China. And while they don't have formalized open law about it, they have a very robust discussion about values. The values are stability, harmony, that's a little bit different than stability, and growth, right? And growth, you need to put that in the context of 30 years ago. It was one of the poorest countries in the world. They have raised some 400 million people out of poverty, which is more than has ever happened as a proportion of the human race in the history of the human race. So they're very focused on that, and they're much less focused on what Western values are. Okay? So we look at them and say, oh my God, these guys are out of control. But relative to their values, they are doing what they believe are good. And they have very strong control over AI.
They do.
They have a privacy law which is more vicious than the European one. It just has no details. So they're slowly working it out. And they have this, for instance, people talk about the reputation mechanism that sounds like Big Brother. And it indeed was like Big Brother. And they promoted that originally because they wanted to promote more trust in society. So you knew who you could trust. They felt that was a problem for harmony, right? And they realized as a government that it was a failure and retracted it as a government policy. However, that doesn't mean that it went away, because the companies still use it, and they're using it in some bad ways in certain corners of their country. So they're thinking about it.
Yes.
You know, in many ways, I find their discussion to be a lot more focused on values and a lot more effective than ours. Although the values are very different, and of course the results are very different. And while I'm happy to see all the bias discussions and things like that, I feel like the engagement of the rest of society and government is not very effective around that, I guess I would say. And I don't know quite what to do about that, but we need to be effective. Can I say just one thing?
Of course.
I'm sorry.
Of
So one of the things that I think people don't understand is that, you know, when you think about GDP, you're thinking about extremely short-term stuff.
Right.
Okay? But there's longer-term things that happen, too, that are valuable. Climate change is one of the classic ones where, oh, you don't have to worry about it for 10, 20 years. It's not going to bite you, right? Okay, except that 20 years from now, it's really going to bite you, okay? So you have this sort of discount rate, and values are a proxy for the things that are going to bite you 5 years out, 10 years out, 20 years out, 1,000 years out. And you can think of them not as good to do. They're just like making the numbers, but they're longer term numbers. And you need to ask, is your company going to be around in 5 years? If you think not, maybe you don't have to worry about values, right? If you want your company to be around in 10 years, you better start thinking about that stuff.